my background's in geology, but also in paleontology. So I've been working with various courses in the geology department. Upper level major courses have been one target of trying to work with faculty and see what they really want students to learn, and then try to come up with ways to help them learn that and assess their learning. So I talked in the fall about, very preliminarily, about a project I was working on, trying to help students in our paleobiology class better understand and be able to use evolutionary trees, and in particular, the kind of evolutionary tree called cladogram. Does everybody know what a cladogram is?
It's one of those things.
Anybody care to explain it? No. No one really wants to do it. Sorry, what?
It's a method for representing bifurcation events.
So, speciation events, more or less. It's basically a diagram that shows relatedness. So, without saying any more about that, I'm going to go on. Just tell you what our project, what I was trying to do. Sorry.
It tells us that we're more closely related to some fish than those fish are to other fish.
Yes, degrees of relatedness. So, for instance, on this diagram here, this is saying snakes are more closely related to lizards than either one of them are to crocodiles or birds, for instance.
So Kevin Bacon, 6 degrees of separation.
More or less, yes. How closely do you nest
Kevin
within
Bacon's
that?
not actually on this.
You know, but that might be something you could do. Yeah. What are the clades that include Kevin Bacon? It could be fun. So I want to caution that I'm going to put some numbers up there, but this is definitely a work in progress. So I'm appreciative of any comments, suggestions you have, and of course questions. Although I see some of our rapid questioners aren't here, but I'm sure you guys will make up for it. So basically what we tried to do is try to develop a module that could be both combining lab and lecture time to try to maximize learning of how to deal with these trees, how to construct them, and how to read them. And I found the reason we started doing this is partly because we had a bunch of students that took this class, the fall class, and they took a more advanced paleo class with another instructor in the spring, and they said, oh yeah, we covered that. Well, guess what? They didn't perform very well on any sort of assessment or discussion in class on using cladograms. So there was a realization that whatever we were doing in that initial paleobiology course was not effective. So I started to dig into the literature a little bit.
So when you say, so what is it that students don't get about cladograms? Was that the right question to ask?
It is the right question. So there's a great couple papers that I'll talk about briefly, and there's sort of 3 skills, it seems like, that you have to be able to do, and there seems to be 4 basic things that students do wrong, or common errors. And so what I'm going to focus on are 2 of them, which I've done a little more digging and found that someone has actually linked those 2 difficulties to some fundamental cognitive science principles, the Gestalt principles. Anyone ever hear of those? How would you explain those?
So are Gestalt principles the ones where you connect things together?
Yeah.
In your mind?
How you group things or categorize things. So, and one of those principles has been recognized independently as being important, but that study didn't map onto these 2 studies that identified the misconception and then identified this Gestalt principle, didn't communicate with each other. They didn't reference each other. And I think there's another Gestalt principle that maps really nicely on the other, one of the other 4 misconceptions. So I want to focus on those because I think there's a good basis for some basics about how people fundamentally look at diagrams like the ones we showed, and some implications for both design of instructional materials and also how we communicate evolutionary trees or cladograms in the public sphere. I think there's some pretty, and I'm not the only one saying this, but I think, at least as far as I've seen, there hasn't been anyone that tried to put these things together. So I got kind of overly curious about how that all worked, and I thought, there's got to be something that maps on. It seems such a fundamental thing. And when I presented in the fall, what everyone said was, I hate these. These are just horrid. These look weird. I don't know how to read these. And these are the ones it turns out people have the most trouble with, versus a diagram like this, different style, with this sort of U-shaped thing that can be used to convey the exact same information. Yes?
And it's not just because of the little pictures?
It's not, but the little pictures are another issue that hasn't been documented before, as far as I can tell, that I want to talk about as well. So, just what we were trying to do is figure out if what we did. The publication, it's 2007 publication in, I think, Biology Education. I can give you the reference if you're interested. I didn't put them on anything here. They developed a conceptual survey that's pretty good. It's statistically valid. There's a few issues with it that I'll mention. Basically just a first run, trying to, by some evolutionary scientists, trying to figure out what it is that students tend to have trouble with, what are the skills we think are most important. And then they were trying to figure out what curriculum might support gaining in skills and not doing so many misconceptions.
And was that by chance Jim Smith's group at MSU?
No, it's Eli Meyer and
So now they've done some work on this too.
Okay.
I wondered if you
Well,
see the-
I'm not familiar with that, so yeah. So then I wanted to just see. So what we did is we gave the same survey as a post-test. I didn't know about it before the class started, so I couldn't give a pre-test. So I'm going to compare the post-test results just to give a sense of whether there's some commonalities and whether our curriculums seem to do a similar job. I mean, that's an interpretation, but that's sort of one way we can look at it and see. And then, again, the generalized stuff. So I basically just said this, the survey analysis, and I want to point out these links that I think are important, and then I have some conclusions that you may or may not agree with, but I thought would be interesting to share and see what you think. So I think we talked a little bit about this. I like the way it's worded here. All evolutionary trees provide the same basic information, a historical pattern of ancestry, divergence, and descent. They do so by depicting a series of branches that merge at points. So here's a merging point, here's a merging point, that represent common ancestors, which themselves are connected through more distant common ancestors. So this is representing a hypothetical ancestor of these two groups. This is representing a hypothetical ancestor of these two groups. And then this divergent point would be representing the ancestor of all of these groups with respect to a certain number of traits that we can measure in some way. Thoughts, questions about that at the moment?
I mean, so when you do that, how many times do you, so I don't know, I know Gregory's stuff is really neat work, but the question is, do students actually understand that they can deduce the phenotype of the common ancestor from the tree?
Yes and no. That's one of the issues.
I mean, so the question is, could you ask them? I mean, this would be an interesting question. Could you ask them whether the base of the tree on the one end,
Right.
you know, how many legs does that ancestor have?
Exactly. So you did a good lead in. So I want to pass out. This is the survey.
I want to roll today.
Sorry. And I think one of the questions I'll show is an example also, but it's question 15 and 16. It's on the third page. It's an example of being able to deduce those ancestral traits. Looking at it later.
What level class is this?
This is a 4,000 level class. It's that's a good question. It's a requirement for geology majors, and so in particular, we're interested in giving geology majors who generally don't have any biology college experience some idea of how this works, and evolution related to the fossil record is the emphasis of that application in this course. So I should mention this is a common, I think I mentioned this last time too, it's a common course that's required for majors across the country who are geology majors. So yeah, if you look at that, just as a sideline, if you look at that third page, questions 15 and 16, it has some walking stick sort of bug things. And the idea is, can you figure out, just as Mike said, some characters or traits of that common ancestor based on the divergence patterns that are indicated. And so those of you who are evolutionary scientists or have a strong background will know that one of the main principles in deducing or making these hypotheses about relationships is that the simplest explanation is best. So it must be the best explanation is parsimonious. The least number of steps is considered most likely, at least in modeling these sorts of things.
That's almost by assertion or definition.
Yeah,
That's a definition of the best, the optimal solution.
Right.
Well, in the absence of other data,
Yes,
The absence of
that's the critical thing.
you don't assume an explanation that's more complicated than necessary.
Right.
That's called Occam's razor.
Any other questions right now? Did you?
Oh, just one, in teaching this to students, do teachers ever invoke the family tree?
So that's an excellent point, and that's actually in the Gregory work that Mike was talking about. It's a paper that basically tries to teach people about how to read it. And in fact, as far as I know, there's not any published work that has a published curricula that I'm aware of that do that, but we did do that in our curriculum that we developed. There probably is, and we're just not, it's stuff people do locally and we're not aware
I
of it.
mean, family trees look more like that, the right side than the left side.
Except upside down.
Except upside down.
The way that they're
Well,
structured.
It should be upside
Yeah.
down because you're propagating in the opposite direction.
Right,
But,
because you have a bunch of ancestors and
You're
less.
propagating out to your ancestors.
Yeah. So it's not the same information content, but there's certain things that are analogically equivalent. So let's just go to that. So here's one of the questions that we developed based on this paper. So here's a family tree that we gave people. Is it better if I point here or here? Probably here. There's more
I can
here.
turn this one off if this is confusing.
I don't know how to do that, so.
You can't do both, otherwise you'll cause people to have things.
Well, I want to be responsive to everybody.
You are responsible.
All right, so here's a family tree that is not complete. It's showing basically one ancestor of all of the people who are living today. And in this case, it's not the upside down version of the family tree, but it's an actual cladogram showing family relationships. So here, two cousins, one of their parents, that's genetically related to one of the grandparents, right? And then you and your sibling and your parent. So here, I think it's intuitive to understand or to consider this as you are closely related to your sibling. You both are more closely related to your parent than either one of you is to your cousins. Does that make sense?
Students get that right?
They actually do, yes. And then we have a series of questions that try to trick them into common errors that they can make. Their reasoning about their knowledge of how their family tree works helps them, at least in some way it seems, to understand what kind of interpretations are likely showing this. So there's a caveat to that I want to come back to. So is anyone aware of where, reading these trees, where are they in sort of standards? Does anyone know science standards? I didn't know either.
But I'm still confused as to what the major errors are.
Okay, I'll come back to that. I just want to show you one thing. So it turns out in the state of Colorado, the biological sciences standards include explicitly generating a model, an evolutionary tree, showing how a group of organisms is most likely diverged from common ancestry. I didn't know that. So this is I don't know if you're familiar with this either. I just found this today through a random search. This is actually a resource that allows you to look up any published standards across the U.S. So I thought I would share that as well because that's kind of useful if you're trying to get for quick information. And it gives some additional information. It lists all the standards, and this is sort of the close-up view of the particular standards. You can see you can search on terms. I searched evolution and came up with a few. So I wanted to share both that resource in case you weren't aware of it, and also the fact that this is in the state, one of the high school science standards. Okay, so to Mike, I'll come back to that if you want to. So let me talk about the 3 skills that were identified. So this is one, the ability to read traits from trees. So a lot of times, either in the literature or in education materials, people will map on character changes. So something that changed between this ancestor and this descendant. So in this case, the stamen of the flower became short and was apparently longer before that event happened, that mutation, set of mutations occurred. So this is again from the survey, which has different questions that they think represent these skills in some way. So this is it's actually right below the walking stick ones, if you're interested, 17 through 20. I mean, this is, as far as I know, a made-up example, not that that matters in any negative way. But this is representative of the kind of diagrams and information that if you had good knowledge and good practice with that skill, you should be able to answer correctly. Questions?
I mean, part of this analysis is always dependent upon whether things are convergent or ancestral.
So we're not even problematizing it to that point.
Okay, because that's the tricky part because all these trees are essentially
they're hypotheses.
They're models.
Right.
What you're focusing
Because the
on
tree depends on what trait.
What you're focusing on is the inference from the tree to the data.
Right.
Whereas the scientific problem is more common in the inference from the data to the tree.
I think that's a reasonable way to put it.
But you always need both. You need both. You need
Both of those are going on.
in order to know how to test your hypothesis
Right.
about a tree.
So just the fundamentals of what experts do, for lack of a better way to put it. How do experts use these? How are they constructed? And what's the information content? How do you learn how to access the information content that's there?
How to generate prediction from a hypothesis.
I mean, at a fundamental level, I hadn't thought about it that way, but that really is. What prediction can you make? And we don't necessarily talk about it that way either, and maybe we should.
Right, because if you could discover that this tree is wrong.
Right.
Because it makes a prediction that is
Right.
not.
May
Yes.
I give a great example of that?
Yes.
Okay, I'm a microbiologist from Michigan State. And bacteria were always, the way that they were first identified and phylogenetic trees created was based on their various phenotypic traits,
Right.
which were found to be radically different when you looked at the ribosomal database.
So comparing molecular data from,
Molecular data, yeah.
right. So huge amounts of convergence then in the phenotypes.
Exactly. Yeah. I guess that's true everywhere, but really
Well, but
profoundly
that's
so.
a profound one at like huge high levels of taxonomy.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So their additional data made a huge difference, and that's, I mean, we don't even, this stuff is so fundamental what we're talking about, we're not even getting to that. I guess we hope we're able to talk about things like that, because that's so important to understanding, again, as you're saying, a hypothesis making a prediction, because one would certainly predict if otherwise, to be parsimonious, you would predict that the phenotypes reflect the same amount of divergence and differences from the genotypes.
But when I look at question 15, what I don't like about these kind of, I'm becoming more and more skeptical about these.
More skeptical?
Well, I may explode. I mean, it would be any one of these answers could be correct with a qualifying assumption. Because what you don't know is how hard it is, you don't know whether the wings presented here are convergence, are independently arising structures or not.
So we're definitely, in
So
these examples, assuming
you're always making assumptions.
Right,
So it'd be
that they are
interesting
not
if somebody
convergent.
answered this and said, why are you picking this?
But
Right.
isn't that part of your parsimony principle?
No, you can't, you just cannot tell.
well, it is. I would say it is, but it's sort of.
There
I
are
guess
plenty-
to me, it's like anything else in science. You learn sort of basic rules at one point, and then you learn all of the exceptions to those rules at some other point, because the exceptions can overwhelm you
Right.
from
Because
the overall
because
patterns.
Otherwise, I can say, the answer to every one of these questions is I can't tell, because I can come up with
Right. No, that's exactly right. And so you'd have to make a secondary hypothesis to be able to answer this unambiguously.
So, and I
Because
guess
you'd have to know about the structure of the wings, whether they are analogous or whether they're
right.
homologous.
So we're assuming that they're analogous. in this-
So if you assume they're
Yes.
analogous,
Right.
that's one thing. If you assuming they were homologous,
Right.
then you get a completely different.
But I think you have to understand how it would look. They're not.
But I mean,
You have to
that's the
understand
critical.
how the pattern would look.
I know, but
when-
that's the
when it's
critical
analogous
idea
first.
here, right? I mean,
That's
the whole
actually-
idea is that these
well-
trees are set up to map homologies.
But if you can't understand the conventions that are used and you can't access
Right.
even that information, then you can't, I don't think, go to the next step to be able to really evaluate hypotheses like that.
So
Well,
isn't the
you're trying to
question?
test a much more basic level of
Yeah.
understanding.
No, but isn't the question, why the hell are you drawing this tree anyway if you don't understand the concept of homology? I mean, to me, if you don't understand what homology means, these trees are based on the assumption that they're homologous traits. Right? They're not based on the assumption, I mean, the Linnaean categorization was based on the idea that, oh, look, they seem to be in the same group, but had nothing to do with homology.
Right.
And that's why it was, I think the word we use is wrong. So,
But we still use it because it's useful, even if there are fundamental things that are wrong.
but the reason it...
In the
but
same
reason
way that
it's-
this is useful, even though it may be wrong.
But the reason you would teach it is because it reflects homologies.
Mhm.
So if you don't understand homology, I mean, you would say, why would you teach trees first before homologies?
Well, homology is a concept I think that you can uncover while you are learning about this. I mean, that's one way to look at it.
But Linnaean did this whole system without ever understanding that these were homologous traits.
This is not
I
Linnaean.
understand that, but that idea that I can put everything in this hierarchical classification scheme, which is Linnaean,
Well,
was
this
all
is
done
hierarchy
without
too,
any-
right?
which was all done without any
Right.
without any explicit appreciation of these
Right.
are homologous structures. That
There's
they were
some-
derived from ancestors.
Right. There's some ancient Chinese classification of things you can eat, things that move, and then things that are black or something. We would find equally bizarre, but worked in a certain context in a certain way.
I'm just
So
throwing
right,
out-
no, you bring up good points, and I just want to emphasize that this is at a fundamentally different level, but I don't want to minimize what you're saying, because I think one way to understand homologies is through this, because I think students do, and I don't have any evidence for this, but if they can get sort of the system and the practice, then they're studying, well, how do you really know that is reflecting an ancestral relationship? I don't think they have the tools to be able to have those kind of thoughts and discussions and debates until they can start to manipulate and read and construct these things.
I would think they would automatically, their ground level assumption would be homology unless
Right.
told otherwise
Right.
because of the family tree. If you're bringing out, your cousins are
Right.
mostly related than you are, then there's that. The homology is the elephant in the room.
I guess you could say that. And I think that Mike's saying that that's a little bit dangerous because that's an assumption we're making, and if we're not questioning that, then that's probably not a good
Well,
thing.
historically, that wasn't, it may seem obvious to you, but it didn't seem obvious
Right.
to anybody until Darwin. So,
Well, I have to say,
I mean, it
it's
seemed to
not
have
obvious
escaped
to a
people's
lot of people
attention.
today who construct diagrams like this. So I think that's an additional
Yeah, I
problem.
think your point is, I'm just thinking about what order you put them in.
Right.
Or do you throw in a tree without what context do you start the tree?
I have an answer for that. We'll
Good.
get to it.
I love it.
Okay. So this is the other one that Mike mentioned, deducing the ancestral traits. So can you look at a diagram based, you could have pictures here, you could have information, data here, but can you figure out some characteristics likely to be present in the common ancestor? So the third one is if you're given data, can you actually draw a tree? And this is the last question on this survey. So here there's 5, this is a little bit funny compared to the way I'm usually thinking about this, but there's 5 fish. These 4 are extant. This is assumed to be the same as one of them. This one, right? And then asking students to draw the tree.
So the assumptions are stated explicitly. We're
Are they?
assuming that each of these traits evolve
Yep.
only once, and so there it is explicitly stated that we cannot.
And do they say no traits are lost?
Yes, they do. Yeah. Okay, so these are the 3 things that they identified. A bunch of evolutionary scientists identified as skills they think were important. Examples of the kinds of questions you might use, the kind of things students might do that would activate or assess those things. So I want to talk about two of the 4 big errors that people make. So one they called, and I use the same terminology they did in their paper just so we can refer to it if we want to. So I'm illustrating D actually here, their 4th error, and that is that a straight line equals no change. Does that mean anything offhand to you guys?
Does that, by that, do you mean that the common ancestor and the sharky-looking thing over here, there's no change between them? Is that what they think?
Yes.
Oh,
So
the straight line on the
The
plate.
straight line in this style of cladogram indicates that there hasn't been change. So in this case, someone might interpret this straight line also being 1 unit, indicating no change. That's a little bit complicated,
Well, so
but
this
that
is
also
a-
is another interpretation that
So
one
this
could
is an
make.
assumption that all evolution is speciation.
No, it's an assumption about how you read this.
It's an assumption that a straight, unbroken line indicates it is equal to
Yes.
the
So
common
Thank you.
ancestor.
there is no evolution along lines.
Yes.
There is only evolution through speciation.
Through the nodes.
Breakpoints.
Through the
Yeah,
breakpoints.
nodes.
Right. Right.
Wait, I'm confused though, because isn't a straight unbroken line is sharp down to the bottom?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here to there,
Mm-hmm.
and that's wrong.
Wrong in what way?
Were you saying that's a common error? That not been any change since that break point up to the shark?
So, do you notice, what are the differences between this one and this one? In the way it's depicted.
Or the order of branching.
Yeah, they were.
So I believe it's rotated a couple of times here about this node, right? So this unit is now over here. This straight line of the human, which often in these kind of diagrams, the ladder diagrams, these are generally referred to, this is the pinnacle of evolution because there's all these breakpoints off of that. So this is the one that has the most difference from this. And so the thing is, you can depict the exact same grouping with this diagram, in which case would you say the fish is the pinnacle of all evolution?
It's not the same. But the straight line from the shark to the bottom has no breaks on it, no nodes on it, no nothing. There is no change on that.
Yeah, that's what you see. But that implies
So-
that the common ancestor looks like a modern shark.
So I think there's 2 things going on
Which
potentially.
ain't true.
And that is there's no change in a straight line like this,
That's
which
the assumption, how I would read
in
it.
which
Right.
case we would just say that there a more expert view would be there's no none of the characters that resolve these relationships show up here. There certainly was evolution, but none of the things that help us group these things together shows up, which is not sort of an easy thing to conceptualize, I don't think. So that's sort of one thing. And I think the other thing is when you see the straight lines, you make interpretations about sort of a more primitive relationship or grouping and a more advanced grouping, which is not implied, not information that is actually contained in this diagram. So the idea is basically a straight line means no change. These lines all represents one thing. So this straight line, somebody might say, means one thing. I don't know if that's making any sense, but it might in a minute.
And maybe a third really big error is that the length of line, I mean, it's the
length of
So
line.
that's actually
But
one of the
applying
other
that-
two ones.
yes.
okay.
No, absolutely.
Applying a metric to a topological space.
Yes. And there's another one. The other one is basically, can you count if this one maybe is more closely related to this guy because I counted one difference here.
Oh, yeah.
So you could
And
count
so-
the number of branches, which is not an appropriate way to use information either. But I don't want to talk more about that now. Question?
Well, kind of. I'm just wondering, like in these two different examples of this tree,
Right.
were they originally choosing between them or making? I'm just wondering, because I do see differences in the two. Like, for example, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 sort of quote nodes in A between the common ancestor and human, and in B there's
You're node counting, so that's
I
not.
don't know. I'm just wondering, is the kind of thing you're asking them to do is to look at that, or
So
what are
this
these two
is
examples
just an
illustrating?
example. It's actually in the paper by Gregory that says these two are equivalent in information content with regards to evolutionary relationships, even if they look different.
One has a goose in it. Doesn't.
Oh, you're right. What the heck?
On the bottom.
That's all right. They're both tetraploid.
This is supposed to be the goose. There's something wrong with it.
Those are not equivalent.
They are
You're
equivalent.
right. They're meant
both
to be.
tetraploid.
I didn't notice that. It got through the editors apparently as well. So I apologize for adding additional interference to your understanding. So what I want to do is look at the two, I think, the Gestalt principles that apply to these sorts of things. These two particular examples. Okay, this is that other one I didn't explain. This is that B one. The idea is tip proximity indicates relationship. So the idea is if this is closest to this, you can say, oh well, this is close to this as it is to this guy here. So D is as close to E as to C. So it's probably equally related to both of them. When in fact it's nested within this grouping.
Right.
So that's not an appropriate inference. So here, this is an example of all the weird things you can do to this kind of tree that makes it look different, but actually has the same information content, annoyingly. So those two things.
So a lot of this comes out of using instead of the circular tree, the David Hillis tree, where everything is in a circle.
Yeah.
That has the advantage that it tries to make the point that everything is equally old. Whereas these have this,
Right.
because there's a left-right bias in the way people
So
look
there's
at
a left-right bias, and then there's how does time flow, and people do wacko things
Right.
with how they think time should flow.
Right,
in
because-
That's a
this
possible
diagram.
thing you could do is to add an entirely, to put each branch into a new dimension space. So you have an ultra
Nice.
only you can read those kind of trees.
That's what academics call an ultrametric space.
Well, if physicists can only come up with 11, I mean, have you seen some of these trees? They have 100, 200 taxa on it, and I don't know.
But I mean, it is important to realize that people look at things based on the way they read. It would be
Oh, yeah.
interesting to know whether people
Right.
who read Hebrew read them differently.
So there was some mention that in something I read, and there seems to be nobody noticed anything offhand. But again, most of these studies are done in North America, so who knows?
That'd be so easy to do.
I know.
You
Got any
take the
Israeli
exact
colleagues
same
or
test and
Arabic colleagues that
you take a photographic negative of it.
Yeah. Right. So actually, I guess I organized it differently than I thought. So let me talk about the survey and how our students did compared to the two surveys, or two populations basically, that used the same survey. So this is in that paper about the survey, and I just want to point out a couple things. There's 20 questions, 33 points possible. They're both multiple choice, as you've seen, and open-ended. And they're scored with a rubric to equal those 33 points. So the rubric was fairly straightforward. I disagreed fundamentally with one scoring, but it's a convention I'm not aware of. So this guy's really friendly, so I'll chat with him about that at some point. So the way that they tried to figure out what are the misconceptions and skills that students are either suffering from or have, what's their level of expertise. So there's certain questions that seem to correlate, at least they think students can, if they have an incorrect answer for certain aspects of certain questions, that means that they're either using this misconception or it means that they have you can assess the level of their skill. So it's fairly complex in the scoring, and it involves a lot of looking at individual scores and mapping out what they did for each of these question groupings, which I was kind of frustrated to find out. Anyway, to give you an idea of how that works. So overall, in comparison, I could not, so this is a follow-up paper to when it's basically the same group of people who designed the survey. They tested 2 different curricula to see if one was better than the other. Basically, one had some slightly interactive computer tools, and the other used more of a paper and pencil sort of thing. So this is the computer tools. This is the paper and pencil. This is an activity. If you were here, happened to be here when I gave my talk in the fall, it was an activity that it was a sort of an invention-like activity, a la Dan Schwartz's stuff, where students, it's outside the particular concept area, but it uses the same ideas. And so we used actually the same thing, as it turns out, and they had a lab and a lecture. So I didn't give a pre-score. This is scaled from 0 to 1. Weird way to do it, but I followed. Unfortunately, when they gave percents, I couldn't figure out, except for back calculating with their N, what their actual score was. So this is what I figured out. It's got to be close to this. I don't know exactly who did rounded what. But our post-score average, at least by this characterization, was close. And I did no test to see if this was statistically different, but I wanted to see if it was somewhat close. And so this is the overall. Our students got about 70% of the questions correct on the post-test, which is pretty close and a little better than the biology curriculum, if you believe that means anything.
Can you describe the computer-based activity that was used?
I actually never looked at it, and I don't know anything about it, but we can certainly chat about it later. It's a commercial product, and it's called Evo Beaker. I think there's a couple of different options. One I think uses Darwin's finches as an example, and the other uses some aspects of plant evolution as examples. And it's based on the errors and the skills that were identified previously. So it's the same set of authors, same set of researchers who designed it. So it's specifically designed to address those things as well.
So they don't know whether if you give them a different challenge, whether they improve.
Right.
I mean, they were trained on this thing.
Right. Okay. So as far as reading the traits, this is what we ended up with. There was a discrepancy between 2 ways that was calculated here. So this is the pre-score. I'm calling it a pre-score. This is the original population that the survey was used on, just trying to assess where are students at, what are the difficulties, etc. So I listed that there. And then these are the 2 tests, basically, of the 2 different curricular designs. And these are, I gave a pre-score. This is our post-score average, just for comparison. So deducing ancestral traits, same basic idea. This is our post. Here was their set of posts in this. So I want to point out our curriculum did not focus on these 2 skills. It did, I think, focus pretty highly on actually reconstructing trees. Students did this with a set of fossils, and they did it in class as well in a sort of clicker question walkthrough. So I'm not surprised to see that the post score on the other 2 the other two skills is not particularly high. That tells me that we didn't address that, and it's not adequate for, if you want to interpret it literally, I guess it's not adequate for improving those skills. So what I want to, a point I want to make is, one way that I might sort of logically think about this is, let's teach students to read a tree first, and then they should be able to construct them. Well, I reverse my idea on that. I think teaching them, having them actually try to construct a tree first, and then be able to read trees is a better way to go, is likely to be more effective. So both the scores here with the students in the other curriculum and our curriculum, you know, these are, I mean, obviously the questions aren't completely equivalent, but these scores are much, much higher. Students tended to make a lot less errors doing this. So I don't really understand why that is, other than I did part of another survey in another paper, and I got a fundamental question wrong looking at the multiple choice. And I was really frustrated because it was an essential point of the paper. Really frustrated about translating between the two different types of trees. But I sat down, didn't look at those, and tried to translate it by hand, and I found my error. So I think it's easier to make errors when you're looking at multiple choice questions because you latch on to what you think is correct. Whereas if you have to draw it out, you're actually activating a lot more skill, reasoning in the process. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. No, engendered cognition.
Yeah.
Huh?
When you do things, it makes a difference, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, we saw something similar with comparing, this was Kelly Lancaster, comparing short answer, the students who took the short answer version of the test versus students who took the multiple choice version of the test, and their long-term retention seems to be better, the ones who did a short answer, where they actually had to draw the thing themselves.
Right.
See, we could test this because we could build an activity on this in Socratic graphs where they would draw the tree and then get on the fly analysis.
Yeah.
So I'm just logistically, I'm wondering how much we'd have to constrain what they draw, but we could have them draw the tree. We can do that. That'd be cool to try something like that.
I didn't look at I didn't do this before today. I thought I might have time, but of course not. Look at individual student scores to see if they missed some of the same skills or misconception questions, multiple choice versus doing it open-ended. So for instance, there are question equivalents, at least by the way that the survey was developed, to reconstructing trees that are multiple choice. So my quick and dirty view is that students who did very poorly on the other skills, which I would think would be more basic, more fundamental, everyone tended to do well on this, regardless of their other scores. So I guess that's not something I would have expected necessarily.
But it would be interesting to ask them for a reason why they put nodes in various places and stuff, because
right.
They're
definitely. Yeah, so I didn't do any interviews with students. A few students, after they took the survey, they really wanted to know what the right answer was, so I did discuss with a few of them and got a little bit of feedback on their thinking. Yeah. So their errors, mostly in doing this, if anyone made any errors, it was that they just didn't follow the convention quite right. There was a lot of, I thought a lot of them communicated that they understood what was happening, but they either missed a character somewhere or they just depicted it in a weird fashion. And the way the rubric, I followed the rubric faithfully, even if I disagreed with it, because I really wanted to do a one-to-one comparison. So there were some things where students did weird things, and I had to mark it down, even though I think they were showing that they understood the basic concepts.
And you actually got numbers that had 3 significant digits, did you?
No significant digits. I just compared.
Sorry, I'm just being
No. So as far as the common errors, the easiest way that they reported it, or the most obvious comparison was in these graphs. So this is basically if there were 7 points, 7 questions or parts of questions that contributed to the way you scored this, how many errors did they make? And here's the same way. There were only 3 points that dealt with questioning this. If the tips are closer to each other, are they more closely related? Does that mean anything? And so I guess I don't know what to say other than the patterns look very similar. I didn't do any other tests to try to figure out. They have a nice big N. I have a smallish but not awful N. So clearly it's worth seeing if the proportions
So
or
how do I
percentages are the same.
interpret your graphs? How do I interpret those top graphs? 0, 1, 2, what?
So these are the number of answers that indicate students hold this misconception.
So out of your 44 students, 3, what?
Like 5 of them made errors here.
Related to specific errors.
Right,
2 of them made 2 errors.
right,
3 of them made 1 error.
right. So, this may mean something that's different here, but I don't know. That's what I got right now. Nothing struck me as being like, oh wow, all of our students made no errors or anything really interestingly different. So
N equals 44, they break out
Right.
many categories.
Right.
that-
And so I didn't pull out geology students. It was about 2/3 geology majors and about 1/3 biology majors, some of which had prior experience. So I do want to make sure I get to the idea that prior experience can be helpful, as some people have shown, but I found some prior knowledge, at least what students thought to be correct, to be a real hindrance. So I want to make sure I get to that. But I want to quickly talk about this. This is where I left off, basically, is I don't like this style. When I was trying to design trees for students to analyze, I had to draw it like this first, because I get distracted by all these straight lines, and I can't think of what the hierarchical relationships are as easily here as that. And I consider myself to have, a moderate level of expertise, at least. So this is a question I had. So I was really pleased that there's a couple of other papers that on studies. Laura Novick, so she's apparently a bigwig in studying how students basically read diagrams. How do people learn how to read diagrams? And she's done some really excellent work recently with sort of linking the cognitive aspects to this. And so she had an excellent sort of idea. They're informationally equivalent, these two things, but not computationally equivalent. So they actually contain the same information, but most of us cannot access it equally well in either form. That this convention is a much easier format by which basically everyone can access.
But I would wonder whether this one doesn't
This one?
enhance the idea that there's no change along a straight line.
Right. So I don't know how that maps onto misconceptions in any real way. But I would certainly say that this would be a preference for teaching, and if you're communicating with the public. So it turns out that these are easier to produce, especially in computer programs. They take up less space, perhaps. She hypothesizes that is why that's a convention. Okay, so I want to link these things. So the idea of proximity, things close together are grouped together as a fundamental Gestalt principle. Any idea what misconception this maps onto of the two? Testing your recall now. So it's the tip proximity. And so this, as far as I know, that hasn't been, no one's made that connection. So I don't know. Maybe it's just me that thinks this way. So here I've sort of graphically indicated what a novice grouping might be. So any of these pairs of tips could be equally related to each other if you are using this sort of system for judging it. Whereas a hierarchical expert grouping would be the green things are basically at the same level, blue thing is a higher level relationship, and then the purple is indicating that higher level yet grouping.
You know, this would be a very, just having a student do that is draw the circles around those. I mean, I'm thinking about how you know, because we could put this in credit graphs. But the point is, that's an easier, you know, I could see that if somebody drew a circle around the wrong place, you could say, what are you assuming?
Right, right.
So that's an interesting activity.
Right. Yeah,
where
so
you would ask
I
them,
haven't tried that.
That would be cool.
It's a definite possibility. In this case, this particular idea is independent of the type. So you could do that the tree diagram, like the goalposts, and this would be, you know, it's not, this idea is this way of interpretation, it's not dependent on which visualization you use. So I found that to be a really interesting, once I learned about these very recently, I was like, oh, I think that matches up. That might be fundamentally why we tend to, if you don't have any other knowledge about how to read these, might be what you do. So this one's even cooler, in my opinion. So there's a Gestalt perceptual idea called good continuation. The idea is that units are, any smooth, continuous entity is one unit, and units differ when there's some sort of sharp angular break. Sound familiar? It's that stupid line thing. So, and this is very well articulated in this Novick and then her colleague, who's a evolutionary biologist, Kevin Kately, Laura Novick. So the idea here then is that this line means one thing. The whole line is a unit of meaning. I don't know how else to explain it. I'm not doing it very well, but and then this whole line would basically be a unit of meaning. So really, the same, I think, visualization. I'm not using this whole line to mean anything. It's just sort of convention of how I stick it out there so that we can see all the relationships. This is an individual unit right here, that segment of that line, not this whole line. This is an individual unit right here, and where they branch together is another unit. Is that difference somewhat clear?
But it's different than, I think, a common tool that people see more often, or a common tree that people see more often, like a business hierarchy.
Like a flow diagram? Or?
Yeah. I mean, so
flow
you've
chart?
got that a line that goes down, like the CEO of a company, an org chart.
Right.
And often you've got all of the executives, and there is that branching, but that line still means the same level for all of those individuals.
Right. So that probably is a good analogy. I don't know if there's a marker, but anyway. So I wonder if the other kind of diagram is sort of better at that because it has those sort of goalposts.
It seems to capture that hierarchical
image
better.
Another diagram is better because, you know, if you have a straight line like this, it does indicate that these individuals are like siblings, for example.
Right.
And then you go to the next level, and those people are all the same generation. So that
doesn't give you these lines to mislead.
Right. A horizontal line indicates relationship.
I hadn't thought about that diagram that you're mentioning, but that would be a really nice analogy for that. Yeah.
And there are some published trees where the length of the line actually does correspond to the numbers of changes.
Or the time.
Or the time,
Right. So that's sort of one extra thing. Right. So, and that's another sort of area where if there are lots of evolutionary diagrams out there that aren't necessarily cladograms, where no time is implied, and so that's a whole other area which people can get really confused. So I'm running out of time. Yes?
So I think with looking at misconceptions, and I'm looking at them too, it seems like the misconceptions that these students have are because of the convention that scientists have developed to show the relationships, the actual cladogram. You know, do they have a misconception with thinking that something is related to something that's actually not?
Excellent point. So that's a whole other thing that I want to mention in just a second. But I think you're saying
do they have
there's two sets.
Yeah, do they have a misconception? Take away these diagrams entirely. They have a misconception that I'm related to a cat or not.
So you notice this is one of the first questions on the survey. I think it's the first question. So students, this is one that I talked with a lot of, I was amazed, I talked to students about this. Students, in my opinion, brought their prior understanding, right or wrong, about the relationships between these groups and superimpose that onto how they were going to make sense of the diagram. So my understanding is the word interference is a good one in this sort of context, that they have there's something interfering. Their concepts about how things are related
Reptiles.
are interfering with their ability to read this. So maybe this has something to do with the fact that students could score very poorly on this question, but still draw trees accurately. At least in this is something that could be tested. They use different reasoning here than they did in constructing the tree because their prior understanding of the relationships were interfering with their reasoning about how to read the graphs. So that's an excellent. I was thinking in the same direction, and I was struck by this. And I haven't seen no one. That's so. I guess my recommendation would be don't use diagrams like this in teaching or assessing when students are at sort of a low level of their skill development, because it's going to interfere. First of all, you're not going to get an accurate reading of what they really understand. That's one way to think about it. Another is they don't really understand because they are not using this to establish the relationships.
So instead, give them examples of exotic animals that they no experience with, and then once they really learn how to analyze them, you give them this and they go, wow.
That's my idea,
Birds are
my
closer to
thinking.
crocodiles, and crocodiles
Yeah.
are to turtles.
Right.
Well, I think that, I don't know if that's obviously done with reading too, but it seems like what I'm learning is that even though the student has some prior ideas about the way things are related, it still might be okay to work with those prior ideas. And they might come off as incorrect at first, but once you start working with those in the curriculum, the student rearranges things so that they use what their prior knowledge was before, even though it wasn't the correct way, and they merge it with the scientific way, and they eventually get there. It takes time.
You do have to get them to confront what their wrong ideas at some point. So I think that supports what you're saying, and that you could approach it with giving examples of things that aren't familiar, but at some point they're going to have to confront the idea that they think mammals are that crocodiles are more closely related to lizards, and they're going to have to get that out of their brains.
Those are excellent points.
It'll be really effective. It'll be most effective, I think, if you get them to realize themselves this and ask them why they thought it this way, and they said, well, we learned that through all reptiles.
But why would you? You'd have to know the difference in the anatomy and the evolutionary background to know why that is. That's not obvious.
I know. Yeah.
So to know why this tree is a good hypothesis.
What is wrong with that? So what is the problem with this tree here?
Well, so
I'm trying to figure out what exactly.
So I don't know exactly, and I didn't. This is just a few conversations I had with students, informal conversations. So some of them had issues with time.
Right.
So I know that mammals appeared most recently. So that must be something about the way time is flowing in this diagram.
So where do they
crocodiles
know that?
are clearly more closely related to lizards because they look more
where
alike.
do they know that from, right? Because mammal-like reptiles or synapsids were there very early, right?
But they don't necessarily know that.
So what are they supposed to?
Right.
What are
Or they take it
supposed to
literally,
know?
as
What
in
are they
this
supposed
is
to
a
know?
kangaroo.
Right, but what are they supposed to know when they look at this tree? I mean, it wasn't until very recently that birds were considered and crocodiles were considered closely related. I mean, it wasn't as if that's obvious. It wasn't. That wasn't the way this tree would have been drawn 20 years ago.
Right.
And so.
Is that entirely based
maybe
on
20 years
molecular evidence?
No,
It's
it's all
based on
morphological.
It's based on what bones you think are really interesting and which ones you.
Okay, now we're getting into other
it's
issues.
based on what things you think are homologous and what things you think are analogous.
So
So all of these things are a decision, unless you're doing molecular stuff. And
they
even
are.
then,
But I think there's wide consensus that this is a
no,
good
there
hypothesis.
is now, but you realize, well, why is that? Why did that? It's not as if this is the obvious tree that anyone who knew about modern animals would come to.
And it isn't, and that's why students have difficulty, I think, in that they're not. So the idea is this is supposed to assess their ability to use the tree.
All right. So they're going to
use the tree in inferring and understanding these relationships, not the inverse, where they're using their ideas about these relationships to infer meaning to the tree.
You're suggesting that for the purpose of teaching them, that don't have them confront this dilemma
not at
right
this
away.
point, right?
Just, irrespective of why they have that prior knowledge, we just know that they have it.
Right.
So,
but this is another example of a.
Since you have no idea what various types of conceptions they can bring in with couches or eats leaves or various things, are you suggesting then that every time you do this, you make up a complete nonsense set of animals so that they have nothing to preconceptions?
Another idea would be, so two things in practice I've seen. One is, so I tend to just go A, B, C, D, E.
Right.
And I've had faculty members say, don't do that, because then they're starting to there's some alphabetical reasoning about it. So don't do that. Mix it all up so it tends to not have a pattern. So the Kately and Novick study suggested that you use the Latin names, use a real tree, prune it like this so there's not a zillion taxa, use Latin names that most of them aren't familiar with, but it's still real. And then, so you're not using an artificial tree, you're using real trees, but you're not triggering the familiarity. So they didn't explicitly talk about this being familiar and that being something that interferes, but at least not the part I read thoroughly. But that suggestion was made, that it's better to use trees that are not familiar. Yeah.
Well,
Mike?
I'm just trying to figure out what the goal. See, I'm interested in what the goal is. What are you trying to teach? Because from a superficial view, lizards and crocodiles look alike. So.
But that's not the evolutionary relationship.
No, but unless you do so the problem is that scientific ideas are counterintuitive, right? It's not like everybody walks out
to everyday experience.
They're not your everyday experience. In fact, they contradict your everyday experience more often than not. And so the question becomes, well, what's the goal? Is it to understand why it is that somebody made this bizarre idea of putting birds and crocodiles as closely related? I mean, what forced them to make this bizarre idea, right, that these are actually more closely related than crocodiles are to lizards?
So I think the main idea is that these are the diagrams that are the common parlance for discussion amongst both experts, and they're used to illustrate concepts in K-12 curriculum.
Right,
however, they are never explicitly, no one has ever explicitly taught what this means. They're just sort of thrown up there. The other thing is that this way of organizing information is closely related to current understanding of how evolution works. So there's some synergy between and feedback between, if you understand how evolution works, you can read these.
Right.
And if you can read these and understand the conventions, then you understand better how evolution works.
But I would argue that this is exactly the problem. The people who are experts have no idea how to teach this. They don't even think about how to teach it. No, not you. But they don't think about it, right? So this captures so much information.
Yeah.
Such a huge amount of information, more than the trivial, doesn't tell you how evolution works. And so there's this disconnect between the sort of jargon that people use in expert speech and how you would teach it if you were approaching this from the point of view of a student who is smart but ignorant of this topic.
Right.
Well, I think
we got to give her a chance to speak. Sorry.
Just maybe one thing that would help clarify it is making a distinction between a cladogram, which gives a map of characteristic traits that you decide, okay, we're going to look at what we can see, versus an actual phylogenetic tree, which is what really happened.
So defining phylogenetic trees is also a challenge because it means different things to different people.
So trying to, but I think it's pretty easy. It's like we know that, I know that I and my two brothers are related. We know that, and there is something that's known out there.
Right.
And so that's the reality out there. And as they say, all models are wrong. Some models are useful, and that's a really good point to make here. That these
Right,
so
right.
If you map this kind of characteristic, you're going to get this kind of tree, but look at this, you map using DNA sequences, and you're going to get a different kind of tree.
Well, I mean, that seems reasonable as well. I mean, certainly there are a lot of things we don't know, and some things that are mapped as evolutionary trees are hypotheses as well.
Yeah. Well, they're all hypotheses.
Well, I thought you said there was some true trees,
Oh.
what we think, what really happened.
It's out there, but nobody
So
knows
maybe
what it
amongst
is.
molecular stuff, you actually know
No.
some characteristics of
There's a
population
true
generation.
There's a true tree, but we don't know.
Well, then you could
The Earth
identify.
had an actual history.
We live in hope that this is true.
Here's the true tree. that we
Well,
actually-
there it is.
Nice!
This is just a pretty tree based on DNA sequence, the
Yes.
ribosomal database. And this is, again, a model, total hypothesis. But some pretty good data went
So-
into this character.
So the branching points then are at the appropriate times that
Relative
think
times,
relatively
take
it
a million
happens.
years, when you get down
Right,
here.
right.
And, a little closer up here.
Cool.
So.
Oh, and there's the mitochondria.
And then the mitochondria and the chloroplasts and
So
other organelles. So
map
it's
the
really
characters
simplified
on there.
because this stuff, there's so much that goes into this tree that it's,
The tree, except when it isn't.
yeah. Well, it's a bushy tree. But,
Well, if we know you had it, we would have had it out earlier.
Yeah, really.
Sorry.
Well, anyhow, I have a set of recommendations if you're interested in reading. And sort of my fundamental message is that tree reading is a skill. We don't usually teach it. We sort of assume people can understand it. As Mike is saying, experts use the language and use them, but it's certainly obvious by this flurry of recent activity in the literature just in the last 3 years that this is rapidly becoming an area of awareness, that this is something that we're asking ninth graders to do, but yet we can't get college students after explicit instruction
We've
to...
given up on the college students.
Yeah,
so we're
right,
gonna
to do...
concentrate on the ninth graders,
So my two recommendations for curricula teaching at this level, these sort of skills, and trying to avoid and confront these misconceptions are, don't try not to teach with known groups until some later point perhaps, and use the tree convention, so the goalposts, rather than the ladder, because you avoid that
So would you recommend
one issue.
constructing trees first or
So
reading trees
I do.
Yeah.
I do. And I don't know how that would work, but it seems to be something that if you can help students make the link between, okay, you just did this, now let's look at a tree that is drawn already and be explicit, help them to really pull out what they did in building that tree, that should help avoid some of the errors, make them better tree readers. Because really, I mean, what do we want students to do? Most of them aren't going to be producers of science, they're going to be consumers. They're not going to run around constructing trees, they're going to see trees in some textbook or, in charts, whatever.
They gotta know who
Some
their boss
creationist
is.
website that says this tree is wrong clearly because of this, and so we want them to be able to read them. Anyway, that's my mantra for today.
Andrea, we have to talk, because we could easily put
I've thought about that.
We
Yeah.
can put them into Socratic graph.
Nice.
And I'd love to see whether the circular trees actually make a difference.
So yeah, the circular trees are not common.
I know they're very
So
uncommon.
I don't know we could think about, make some hypotheses about what would be different and similar about how
It might be fun
they
to
read.
think about that, because,
Yeah.
but I think we could build building an activity in Socratic graphs is really easy. And so the question would be, how would we scaffold that?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's
Even things like, circle the common ancestor that has
Yep.
limbs, or circle the one that doesn't. I mean, even things that are really, just logistically, when people draw things, when you do it on a graph, we constrain them to X, Y, right? If they're drawing freehand, then it's trickier.
right.
So
So in your tools, can you grab a branch? Could you have some graphic that you could then place?
You could put a graphic in there and have them draw around it.
Okay.
Right, that would be easy. So we build it, the way it works right now, you can put a graphic and have them draw all over it.
Right.
In response to questions.
Right.
They can't move anything, there would be a static graphic there, then they could draw anything they want. So the question would be, if I scaffold something and put some pictures, could I have them draw lines between them or whatever? I could do that. And that would be easier. It's just a matter of programming.
We should talk about it
Yeah, I'll show it
sometime.
to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.